Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, once more to the never-ending struggle, where we talk about the triumphs and tragedies of the Catholic Church through history, sometimes small incidents, sometimes long processes. And today we are going to look at something at an historical development, which has had a very big effect on all of us English-speaking Catholics. If we're fond of Chesterton and Belloc by the Oratorians, if we've gone on pilgrimage anywhere in Britain to places like Walsingham or Ramsgate, or for that matter, Glastonbury or Our Lady of Wisdom, if you've done any of these things or have any connection with these things, then you and I are heirs to something that was called the Catholic Revival. In Great Britain, people differ as to the exact dates, but for our purposes, we'll say 1815 to 1915. That was a time that established not only the course of British Catholicism, but had a huge effect on American, Anglo-Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Anglo-South African, and other places, varieties of Catholicism down to the present day, even India, Pakistan. In other words, if you're a Catholic in the English-speaking world, then what we're going to cover today is key to how and why you have the kind of faith, the type of faith you have, the sort of practice you have. So let's go back to the beginning, to the year of our Lord, 1815, to England. The situation of the church in England in 1815 was a bit better than it had been just a few years previously. Prior to the French Revolution, it was a pretty dismal place to be a Catholic, England was. Ireland, Scotland, all of them were under the post-Protestant revolt penal laws. They had loosened up somewhat. In 1778, George III had spearheaded Catholic emancipation in England, the first Catholic Emancipation Act, which, however, he soon lost interest in due to his feeling of betrayal by the kings of France and Spain when they backed some rebellious colonists of his. Nevertheless, despite that relaxation of the law, Catholics in those three countries, in England and Scotland, were a small minority, generally connected to one or another noble or landowning family that had not given up the faith, despite all the problems resulting both in the Protestant revolt, the wars of the Three Kingdoms, and the Jacobite campaigns we spoke about on other occasions. It was a pretty desperate place to be a Catholic. The liturgy was very quiet. High masses were virtually unheard of. Very few, if any, processions. Catholicism was a quiet religion in the Three Kingdoms in those days. There were still a few places like Holywell in Wales that were still seen as shrines, and Catholics still went to them. And there were a lot of them in Ireland, of course, where the bulk of the population retained the faith, and where, alongside the Protestant Anglican Episcopal hierarchy, there remained a Catholic hierarchy. Now, in England and Scotland, there were vicars apostolic who were bishops, but they were not the bishops of the old sees. As far as an independent political or intellectual or literary or artistic life, Catholics really didn't have much of one. And the general feeling prior to the French Revolution in Great Britain was that Catholicism was part of the barbarous Middle Ages, that Protestantism had brought freedom and light and modernity and blah, 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 blah. That being the case, however, there was also a tradition amongst the so-called High Church Anglicans that was a bit more friendly, very often connected to the Jacobites and the so-called High Tories. These were sort of the seedbed, in a sense, of the Catholic revival, but it required a couple of other things to start. One was the French Revolution itself. The reason for this was that a lot of French and other Catholic refugees from Europe, from the French Revolution, from Napoleon, came to England And simply by being who they were, fighting alongside the British against their common foe, wherever they settled, tended to loosen up, weaken enmity toward the faith. Because in many places in England and Scotland, Catholicism for generations have been seen as something simply foreign and weird. Many English, Scots, and Welsh had grown up without ever actually knowing any Catholics. It helped a great deal when they started to meet them as allies in a common battle. But something else was happening in continental Europe, which would have a major effect on the growth of the church in the British Isles. And that was the Romantic movement, spearheaded in continental Europe by people like Novalis in Germany and Chateaubriand in France. It went into a number of different directions eventually, but a very strong element of it was pro-medieval and was interested in reviving the church from the devastated position it was in as a result of the Revolution, Napoleon, and so on. In Protestant countries, Romanticism tended to make the Middle Ages respectable again and to make people look a second time at the religion that animated the Middle Ages. Well, as we mentioned before, the great catalyst and the great introducing figure of this movement in the British Isles was a man named Sir Walter Scott. And Sir Walter Scott, single-handedly in England and Scotland and Ireland, made Catholicism respectable, although he himself was not a Catholic. He was an Anglican, which in itself was a minority religion in Scotland. At any rate, thanks to Sir Walter Scott, a number of people began to take a second look at the Middle Ages. Now, this was particularly true in the early part of the 19th century in the two great university towns of Cambridge and Oxford. These were two medieval universities which had turned Protestant, of course, and had gone through the various ups and downs of English history, but whose medieval and Catholic origin was very evident. Even today, you've got colleges like Corpus Christi and so forth, who in customs like their Latin graces, the hymn to the Eucharist on Magdalen Tower in Oxford every May 1st, they kept some of the trappings of Catholicism. More of that would emerge. In Cambridge, about 1827, a man named Kenelm Digby wrote a book called the Broadstone of Honor, which was sort of a personal tribute to chivalry and knighthood. His interest in these sorts of things led him to actually become a Catholic. He converted other people in Cambridge, of whom some names, Ambrose Phillips Delisle and people like that, would become very, very active in restarting different elements of Catholic life, bringing over patronizing religious orders, for instance. Ambrose Phillips Delisle would end up sponsoring the return of the Cistercians to England, as an example. Well, that was in strictly Catholic circles in Cambridge. Over at Oxford, something more complex was going on. There, several people, John Keble, John Henry Newman, Pusey, began looking at the Catholic past of England and began thinking of the Church of England as being essentially a Catholic body that had been Protestantized. This was the so-called Oxford movement. From the Oxford movement came a whole host of things. On the one hand, it did alter, although not as much as they would have liked, it did alter the nature of the Church of England in some ways. It altered their worship, brought back Eucharistic vestments, eventually religious orders, shrines, prayers to the dead, Marian devotions, devotions to the saints, all these sorts of things that have been absolutely absent from mainstream Anglicanism, bit by bit, would come back, thanks to the Oxford movement, to what was called Anglo-Catholicism. But Anglo-Catholicism also produced a number of direct converts to Catholicism, of whom, of course, St. John Henry Newman was the most famous. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Cambridge and Oxford were two initial centers of conversions to the faith. A very important individual who should never be forgotten is Blessed Dominic Barberi, the Passionist priest who received Cardinal Newman into the church. But all the while that these things were going on, there were also things that would affect the church favorably on the political front. As I mentioned, the first Catholic Emancipation Act was 1778, but Catholics still had a lot of disabilities that they labored under, including being unable to vote, being unable to build churches in public, being able to do all sorts of things, really. This would come to an end in 1829, thanks to the efforts of an Irish political leader named Daniel O'Connell, also called the Liberator. Now, while he's best known in his guise as an Irish politician, it's important to know that his efforts, especially his early efforts, led to the lifting of most of our civil disabilities in 1829. So from that time on, Catholics could vote. They could do all sorts of really important and tremendous things. Now, from that time on, the Catholics in England really began to feel their renaissance, their return. But mind you, the old Catholics, as they call them, nothing to do with the Dutch people by that name, but the old English Catholics, the old Scots Catholics, they were still very, very small minorities, but a disproportionate number of the conversions began to be made, like Newman, like his disciples, Father Faber, the later Cardinals Manning and Wiseman, folks like that. They were brilliant, brilliant men, great writers, great thinkers, great theologians. And then, starting in the 1840s with the potato famine and things like that in Ireland, you had a large number of Irish come over to England and to Scotland. So between some conversions, the eruption of the Irish, and the continued growth of the native Catholic community, the numbers of Catholics in England and Scotland continued to rise. Now, I've mentioned both Father Faber and Sir John Newman. Sir John Newman is our own Philadelphian Archbishop. We'll leave him out of this. But Sir John Newman and Father Faber founded, respectively, the Birmingham and Brompton oratories. Now, these are very, very important places in the history of English-speaking Catholicism. Of course, founded by St. Philip Neri. To this day, they're companies of priests who live in community but without vows. And they are generally very big in terms of parishes as centers of orthodoxy today, which is very, very important. During the same period, and now we're looking at the 1840s, the 1850s, you had a rise in Anglo-Catholicism, as mentioned earlier. And these very, very often, Anglo-Catholicism acted as a sort of halfway house into the Catholic Church. Now, of course, there was another sort of Anglo-Catholicism, which basically convinced its adherents that they didn't need the Catholic Church because they had everything they needed in the Church of England. Obviously, people of that sort were not really keen on converting. Nevertheless, for a lot of people who've been very Protestant-minded, it introduced them to the idea of the sacraments and so on. And it has to be said, they produced a number of very interesting and useful writers on their own. As the numbers increased, as the influence of the church in England and Scotland increased, the national hierarchies were revived. Now, in Scotland, this was done more or less according to the old medieval dioceses. But in England, it was very different. The English and Welsh hierarchy was not recreated along the lines of the medieval dioceses, but rather totally new ones. And this was actually done by Blessed Pius IX in hopes that the Church of England would want to reunite with Rome as a body, as people like King Charles I and James II had hoped for. It was not to be, but Pius IX, who would also invite all of the Orthodox bishops, all the Orthodox patriarchs rather, to Vatican I as participants. Well, similarly, he was keen on reuniting the Church of England to Rome. In both cases, of course, his efforts were doomed to failure, but nevertheless, they tried. It was not only the Oratorians, however, who spread the faith in England and Scotland. As the 19th century wore on, you had more and more religious orders reestablished or established for the first time in England. The Canons Regular of St. John Lateran, the English Benedictines, who had survived in exile, returned to England and founded places like Douay and Ampleforth and Downside, Fort Augustus and Pluscarden, and all these abbeys. Same for the religious orders of women who returned, the canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre, and orders like that. They set up schools. It's almost mind-boggling how fast the church in England and the church in Scotland and Wales reestablished itself, given the several hundred years of persecution and difficulty that they had labored under. The devotion to the martyrs became very, very big. St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, and many, many, many more were, their memories were looked at again, their causes for beatification reintroduced. Similarly, the ground was laid for great literary revival as the 1870s turned to the 1880s and the 1890s. And you had a number of literary converts, the Meynells, Dowson, Thompson wrote The Hound of Heaven, Lionel Johnson. They kept coming. It became really an extraordinary thing. The Jesuits returned to England. They had their flagship school at Stonyhurst, and their London church, Farm Street, which to this day is still in their hands. It's still very famous. The Dominicans came over. The growth in Catholic life was exponential on every field, and all sorts of Catholic institutions began to be reestablished. But it was probably in terms of cultural and literary output that their mark would be made, not just in Britain, but in the rest of the empire, the rest of the Anglosphere.